Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Tuesday at 5. RPM is about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Every week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in NYC. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
Yo, it's good New York. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute on WBAI 99.5 FM. We're a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The DSA is the largest socialist organization in the United States, with approximately 56,000 members nationwide, and NYC DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our over 5,500 members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. ICE's reign of terror is tearing families apart as concentration camps of asylum seekers proliferate across the border. Trump has intensified the war on immigrants, but state violence directed against the workers of the world is a deeply rooted tradition of the American ruling class. Today, we're joined by Elijah Stevens and Britt Stern from the DSA Immigrant Justice Working Group, as well as Marvin Gonzalez, to discuss the collective struggle against the deportation apparatus and how we organize for the socialist horizon of a world with no borders. But first, briefly, the headlines brought to you by The Thorn. At the conclusion of the recount and court case in the race for Queens District Attorney, Tiffany Caban trailed by just 55 votes and conceded. The impact of her campaign has been felt throughout New York City, and the progressive coalition that backed her, including Queens DSA, is setting its sights on next year's races. The Queens machine continues to be at it, and also awarded a state Supreme Court seat to a judge who lost his civil court primary in June. Our daily headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by NYC DSA Electoral Working Group, covering local politics and radical activism. Subscribe at thethorn.nyc. All right, so after our more brief edition of the headlines today, we're just going to jump right into the episode and introducing our guests. So we have Marvin Gonzalez, Elijah Stevens, and Britt Stern, and I'll start off with Marvin. So, what got you involved in the movement for socialism, and why did you join DSA?
I've been a part of socialist groups for over 10 years, and I thought that they played a very interesting part in transmitting a lot of historical and political traditions across generations. But what really attracted me to DSA in 2017, right after the Donald Trump election, was that this was the first organization in my lifetime that I thought had real organizational capabilities to really change the world and really create a socialist program for the first time in generations.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting what I've heard from a lot of people who have joined us on the show, which is a lot of people were attracted to DSA because they saw it building actual power and they had a real chance of influencing the horrors that are happening on a daily basis. Elijah, same question for you. Why did you join DSA?
Yeah, well, you've had me on the show before, so I've given a bit of my backstory, but I don't assume that every one of your listeners has listened every single time. So
we're doing our best.
I grew up in a lefty household, but the late 90s and early 2000s weren't exactly a time of a lot of social movement organizing. I went to a lot of Iraq War protests as a kid, but it was only when I moved to New York and realized that just being like a leftist reading books didn't actually do anything, and similar timeline to everybody else, I got involved sort of late summer after the end of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and then got really plugged in after Trump's election, and immediately got involved in the Immigrant Justice Working Group because I didn't have a lot of organizing experience, but I did speak Spanish, and so it felt like the best place to plug in.
Yeah, a place that you could use your skills to not just talk about how terrible the world is all the time, which is easy to do, but actually try and change material reality, which is what we're trying to do.
Which is hard to do, it turns out.
You can't just, there's no magical incantation to bring about socialism, unfortunately. So Britt, what about yourself? Why did you get involved in DSA?
Yeah, my trajectory is similar to Elijah's, I think. I have, I've been in New York, and I've been practicing immigration law for about the past 5 years. Of course, with the election of Donald Trump, there was a lot more of a politicization of immigration, obviously, a lot more focus on that. It became something that came up for me all the time. What do you do? I'm an immigration attorney. And I saw people's reactions being so different than what I had always aligned with and what I felt what my work was about. So I just kind of started doing a deep dive into, what is it that I believe in and why am I, in this work? And that's when I sort of found DSA. And then I also from there started to look at, saw the Immigrant Justice Working Group and wanted to really become more involved in that and their work.
What you're highlighting there and what Elijah also brought up is how people saw, especially with Trump being elected, that immigration was this critical front of struggle.
Right.
And recently, both here in New York in June and a week and a half ago down in Atlanta, NYC DSA and then DSA nationally has endorsed open borders. So we've declared this as a priority for our organization. So why is it so critical for us as socialists to organize for immigrant justice?
So immigrant justice is sort of at the forefront of the struggle for international working class rights and the working class movement. Because immigrants are often the frontline communities, both geographically in against climate change, we see with refugee crises, but also because they are the frontline in Trump's war on the poor. And so I think that's why it's really important if we have solidarity and if we are a working class movement, then that is immigrants. And so that's why this struggle is a socialist struggle.
It is like workers of the world unite, as even though you see some people who claim to be leftists on Twitter seem to think that borders somehow protect workers, even though history has shown it to be the exact opposite case as a way for the ruling class to divide and conquer. I guess before we dive into the work that DSA is doing now, as well as the kind of horrors that are being perpetuated on immigrants through Trump's regime, first, we just want to talk about what borders actually are, and how they emerged as a mechanism for the capitalist class to dominate the international working class. Britt, you want to have a go at this one?
Yeah,
I know
sure.
I'm giving you a really big theoretical question.
Yeah, it is a big topic, and there's many different answers, of course. But borders are they're a boundary that is a delineation of a political sovereign entity or a legal jurisdiction. But as you mentioned, it's also been used as this sort of policy tool. Even though borders are usually somehow they're geographical or they're cultural, they're also a result of policy decisions that have been made, and they aren't natural in any sense that they aren't necessarily natural. So I think that where you're born then confers on someone, different rights in different places. And with the emergence of the freedom of capital to move into internationally, we've seen the ramping up of border enforcement to restrict people's rights to move freely. So that's sort of, capital's interest has always been in exploiting labor as much as possible, obviously to enhance profits. So that has meant to destabilize anyone's ability to be here, so that it divides the working class and focuses our attention on those struggles instead of the larger international solidarity that we're trying to create.
Yeah, I think what always really comes to mind, I think when you're talking about this, like how borders, we perceive them as these like natural functions, even though like for anyone with like even a drop of like a knowledge about American history would understand that the borders that we have are the byproduct of conquering land from other people. This oftentimes this land that was held in common as well, and transforming it into a system for profit, and that this was done through war and plunder and genocide, and that if we're going to talk about this, you can't just like erase the history of what really happened, and this was about consolidating and projecting empire.
Right.
Yeah. So Greg Grandin is a historian and writer who has written a lot on borders and empire, and he has a book called The End of the Myth, in which he sort of outlines this idea that borders are sort of the latest stage in the imperialist project, and that after at the end of the project of westward expansion, when there was basically no borders, and immigrants were encouraged to come to the U.S. to basically serve as tools of white colonization of the country and be used for free labor. We saw as sort of that project was completed, a closing of the borders through very explicit racialized and politicized and class restrictions, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Sort of in thinking about this show today, I was reading some of his writing, and one thing he raised was that the first border, the actual physical border wall in the U.S. Was built with recycled materials from the Japanese internment camps. And I think that's really stunning symbolism of the way that this project has been used to reinforce racial and class categorizations, and to sort of make it so that there is always a class of people that can be exploited for their labor.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about the imperial nature of borders, I think we also need to talk about how it's a development of the nation state, right? When we say that these things are not natural, that it's also very new. For a long time, we didn't have these highly delineated, highly militarized, contained nation states. So we have to analyze, like, why are these nation states developing? Why are they becoming so congealed? And what does that form look like? And what are its effects on, like, the imperial and global nature of capital?
Yeah, I think, well, everyone is bringing up some really great points. And then, like, on the subject of, like, nation state formation, I think what Elijah mentioned before, the Chinese Exclusion Act, I think it's really critical to mention that the first act of creating immigration quotas was explicitly racist, and that the border regime and the deportation apparatus have all been about, one, like maintaining this construct of white supremacy and this hierarchy of whiteness within American society, as well as what happened at the similar time was that people could be targeted for deportation if they were leftists, if they were communist or anarchist. Even someone like Emma Goldman, who was born in the United States at the age of 2, was deported for being an anarchist. So it's always been this political project about establishing racial hierarchies, as well as eliminating threats to multiracial working class organizing. Mm-hmm. So this has been and that process is, I feel like, so critical in the construction of nation states, particularly in the West in general.
Yeah. Just quickly, another thing to recognize is that while we think of the border as an increasingly strict thing that keeps people out, it's also been tactically used to let enough people in to provide an ample labor force, but a weak labor force who is always under threat of deportation and detention and has less ability to organize because they are temporary workers, because they are immigrants, because they don't have full citizenship. And so capitalists are totally fine with there being a certain amount of immigrants coming in because it provides them with a weak labor force.
Yeah, I think that even though borders are definitely a nativist and white supremacist project, there's also this tension at the heart of it, which is that there is this need for capital to exploit labor and to gain new markets for labor. And earlier, Britt and I and Elijah were talking about how at the same time that the Chinese Exclusion Act happened, there was also a push for more Mexican immigration into the U.S.
Yeah, at the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act is when you get much more immigration moving up from Mexico. So the only reason why that sort of nativist pushback was allowed by capital is because there was another source of this labor that could come in to support all of the industrialization that was going on.
I think something that just happened that really highlights what you guys are all talking about in terms of how borders are weaponized against labor and manipulated by capital is what happened down in Mississippi,
right,
where you have these 670 workers rounded up, thrown into cages. Some were released the next day, but still it's absurd to be throwing someone in a cage in general. But they were punished. Terror was unleashed on them. But the boss, the person who is profiting off of getting around the system, faced no punishment whatsoever. Everything was fine for him. And we don't have to embrace a logic of punishment, but I think it just really demonstrates the way that things are happening now is that they'll politicians, right-wing politicians who are acting on behalf of capital will dangle something in front of your face of workers that, oh, we're on your side. See, we're trying to keep out the workers that are keeping your wages low, when they don't care about that whatsoever.
Yeah, I will say that so economic sanctions is something that people are talking about, sort of fines for the bosses who employed undocumented labor, and that while I will be the first in line to punish bosses. Economic sanctions against people who employ undocumented labor has shown to be not useful because they will always just be willing to pay the fines and keep exploiting undocumented workers. This is why we organize as socialists. This is why we see it as not punishing individual bosses. We need to strengthen unions, and we need to decriminalize border crossings and push for an open borders policy so that all people can organize.
And what's interesting is not that the bosses weren't just punished, is to think about how that raid may have specifically been used as a tool for the bosses to disrupt some of the organizing that was happening in that community.
Yeah, I think it's very crucial to mention that was a unionized factory, which in the South is extremely rare. The South is one of the least unionized places, not in the United States has the lowest rate of unionization, but it's one of the least unionized places in the world.
That one of those poultry processing plants was literally, it was an organized workforce who they had a settlement of $3.25 million from the company because of harassment, sexual harassment and workplace harassment, discrimination, targeting of Latino workers. So it seems pretty clear that it was retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes perfect sense considering that we have both a boss and a sexual predator as the head of our executive branch. So I just, before we dive into the organizing that's happening right now, I think it's really important to talk about why people are actually fleeing their homes in Central America. And like the role that U.S. imperialism had in unleashing this refugee crisis in the first place. So Marvin, is it a mere coincidence that the U.S. began further militarizing the border following Reagan's dirty wars and NAFTA? And I mean, this history goes back even further than that, if you want to dive on.
I mean, absolutely not. There's been decades and decades of U.S. intervention in Latin America, beginning, especially in Central America, beginning with Guatemala in 1954. The U.S. intervened after a 10-year revolution that saw Guatemala have its first democracy and probably its only democracy until 1996. This was the beginning of invasion after invasion that culminated in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and recently in Honduras. You mentioned Reagan, but it's important to point out that El Salvador began in 1979 under Jimmy Carter's regime. So there's cross-party consensus on the way that the U.S. should intervene in Latin America. And most recently, under Barack Obama's regime, in Guatemala, not in Guatemala, in Honduras, Manuel Zelaya was ousted. The U.S. refused to call it a coup, even though he, soldiers took him out of his house in his pajamas and forcibly exiled him. And not only that, the Secretary of State then, Hillary Clinton, organized with other Latin American countries to prevent his return. And Zelaya, for a long time, was just thought of as a left liberal, and up until a certain point, he started moving more to the left, especially with more of the pink tide in the Bolivarian movement, and that was seen as a threat to U.S. hegemony in that region, not just by capitalists, but also by the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I think it's in addition to that, there's there's very specific things that have developments that have occurred that have increased the violence, both obviously these interventions in these wars and the way that they've occurred, in the sense that the leaders of the cartels and the descendants were trained at the U.S. School of the Americas, and not just the cartels, but the dictatorships all across Central and South America. And these dictatorships and these cartels have unleashed massive amounts of violence. And these regimes, whether we're talking about on the government scale or these kind of almost like neo-feudal drug empires that are deeply intertwined in both U.S. empire and the international finance system. It's constantly happening where you discover that the cartels have been they've been laundering hundreds of billions of dollars through international financial institutions, and the financial institutions are just given a slap on the wrist because everyone in the ruling class just knows that how his business is handled. Jump in.
It's also, part of that conversation is also just the fact that the increased militarization of the border, which has happened since, the 80s, makes it more lucrative for the drug cartels, and entrenches it further.
Yeah, I mean, people have noted how interesting it is that El Paso is deemed like one of the safest cities in the country, but right across the border, it's one of the most dangerous, and we have to ask why. If the border is a direct result of that, I mean, the border is what causes that sort of juxtaposition, and then it's because capitalists need to create very real and very juridical distinctions of workers, and we see that at the border.
Yeah, we've the U.S. ruling class has created a world in which there are no borders for capital or its imperial apparatus, but there are militarized, harsh borders for labor more than ever in human history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of exactly touches on the other side of the political intervention, is the capital intervention, is the free trade agreements of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And so those very specifically put in policies across North and Central America to allow this free trade, free flow of capital, open borders for capital, but not for people. And it's no coincidence, as everybody has said, that border restrictions and immigration restrictions have gone hand in hand with the opening of markets and trade that have utterly devastated rural and agrarian communities across Central America and Mexico.
And just to add, there's also, with that also comes the attempt to regulate how labor will then enter the United States. And so we get programs like domestic worker programs, which are just capitalist programs to try to be the ones who determine the criteria for workers coming into the States.
Yeah, and I think in terms of NAFTA, which really highlights the manner in which this notion of like free markets is something that just like happens through competition and not through state-directed policy, is such an absurdical farce, is the sense that it was designed specifically to spread U.S. agribusiness in Mexico and to destroy the small peasant agriculture in Mexico. And this has directly resulted in mass migration to the United States. So you are listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI, broadcasting in New York City at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for our newsletter to get links to what we talk about on the show. You can do that at our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, and you can also find us on Twitter at NYCRPM. Today, we are talking about the border, the terror that is being unleashed by the American ruling class against the international working class, and our socialist horizon of a world without borders. So now we want to kind of dip into the work that DSA is doing, organizing against the state's violence against the working people of the world. And so, like, what sort of organizing has DSA Immigrant Justice Working Group been engaged in over the past few years, and what types of tactics and strategies have been utilized in this struggle?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I mean, organizing around immigration issues is very challenging. I mean, organizing around many issues is challenging, but immigration, particularly because the enemy you're facing is these federal, undemocratic, untransparent, heavily militarized police force in ICE and CBP. And so the sort of strategy we've taken is, how can we intervene on the local and state level to make our communities safer for immigrants? So we've done a lot of different kinds of work, some sort of base building oriented work around trying to expand sanctuary on the local level. And the big campaign that we have done in the last year and a half was to end ICE courthouse arrests. In New York, after Trump was elected, ICE turned to picking on people who were going to court and making arrests both outside the courts and inside the courts. And so we took up a campaign along with other organizations throughout the city to fight back against this. Initially, this campaign was focused on sort of awareness raising in the general community because it was not known about to most people. and then canvassing and petition gathering to try and put pressure on the court system to change their policies to require ICE to carry a warrant. We've seen across the board that one of the best ways to push back against ICE is to make them have a warrant, and that wasn't necessary for them to do these courthouse arrests. So we were pressuring for that, and then lobbying for legislation on the state level that would formalize that policy. We weren't able to get that legislation passed, but in that fight, we were actually able to get the court system to adopt a new policy to require warrants for ICE in making courthouse arrests, and that has led to a drastic drop in the number of courthouse arrests, and so that's really exciting. So that's some of the sort of interventions we've done, and I'm sure other people have other things to bring into the play.
Yeah, it's really great to see like that work have an effective payoff, because organizing doesn't always end with a success. And while the legislation didn't pass, we covered more in detail this organizing campaign in a previous episode that aired back in May. If any of our listeners haven't heard that and want to check that out, but raising awareness and also having a direct result where now there are less courthouse arrests is a really productive gain. And then it's not just been over this past summer, but over the summer in particular, there's been an increase in direct actions targeting both ICE facilities and the corporations that profit off of their terror. And the DSA has been engaged in these actions, as well as other groups such as Cosecha and the Never Again Action Network. And it's been very powerful to see so many comrades put their bodies on the line against state violence. So what do you see as the strategic purpose of these tactics? How does direct action build power against the imperial capitalist state? And is there revolutionary potential in these defensive measures against state violence?
So I think we've seen, I was at this action on Saturday where over probably nearly 100 people from many different organizations, including many people who were not, organizing in an organization, got arrested, putting their bodies on the line. Specifically, this line being the West Side Highway, all 8 lanes blocking traffic for about 40 minutes, demanding the closure of ICE detention camps and the abolition of ICE. And I think that we are seeing a huge rise in direct action and mass mobilization against these really awful, inhumane immigration policies, at more than basically any other movement right now. That as a tactic is a way of showing real solidarity against a system that we don't really have other ways to implement pressure on. As I was sort of saying, one of the challenges being that we're facing a really undemocratic force. We can even do things like try and limit budget on spending on ICE and CBP, but we see that Trump can implement, national emergencies and then implement his own discretionary spending that way. And so I think people have turned to direct action as one of the few viable ways left to intervene in an truly undemocratic system. And I think it does have revolutionary potential. I think it shows other people what it takes to speak out. I don't know if other people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that I was also at the action on Saturday, the Close the Camps action, and I did not I didn't get arrested. There was trainings that went on for people to do that, but I will say that I think being a part of that and seeing that happen, being a part of the march, was inspiring in a way that I think that, these are small actions. We saw another one in an Amazon store that people also got arrested. So I think that it shows solidarity that's happening, and people are aware, and people are moved to do something to stand up for our immigrant communities and the larger working communities that we have. So I think that the revolutionary power is in that the starting, and I think that also the direct actions, the strikes, are always been the things that have gotten these larger things done, and it's sort of what we sort of need to start organizing to do.
Yeah, I don't know if there's revolutionary potential, but I think that in any revolution, like, the question is, can life go on as it has? And I think it's inspiring to see all of these comrades, really put their bodies on the line to say, as there are concentration camps on the border, as people are dying all over the world, that no, life cannot go on as it is going. And I think that might be the seed of something revolutionary.
Yeah, it throws like a wrench into like the imperial presidency in a certain sense, that it disrupts the functioning of an undemocratic apparatus in really the only way that we can. And crucially, it just raises consciousness among people. I think especially when like corporations like Amazon are targeted in these efforts, it really highlights to people how like these like clean corporations that like to present themselves as like away from exploitation, even though obviously someone like Amazon is like one of the most brutal economic exploiters in the world, are deeply integrated into state violence. That like a lot of the money that they make is so rooted in that. And so we've been like primarily talking about what we're organizing against. But like, what are we building towards as socialists? What are open borders, and how does it translate workers of the world unite from an ideal to a material reality? Marvin, is this one that you'd like to take?
Sure. I guess, first of all, I have a little different story than Elijah and Britt. I haven't really been a part of the Immigrant Justice Working Group. I've been a part of more of labor struggles in New York City. And as I was partaking in those things, one thing that I really started to understand is that how important it was to understand immigrant justice, the intersection between immigrant justice and labor. A lot of the projects that NYC DSA took on, like B&H, which I think, in my opinion, is a classic example of a runaway shop, and also with Tomcat Bakery, which has happened after there was an I-9 audit, which is when DHS and ICE come and say, question the criteria for workers. I think that really kind of radicalized me in understanding labor and immigrant justice as really intertwined. So I, with the help of Immigrant Justice, went to Tijuana to do border solidarity work, and it really just kind of set it home for me that borders are violence. Borders kill people. Borders separate people. I was on a march from INM, the immigration agency in Tijuana, to the consulate, and even there, like, there were highly militarized soldiers, and the people there were afraid. This was right after a lot of them had been assaulted at the border, and it just became so clear to me that the violence is very real here.
Yeah, borders are not abstract, that their purpose is to divide and conquer, and the only way to do that is to hurt people.
Yeah, and I would say that, sort of to get back to your question, like this as open borders as a vision, I think one of the challenges of doing immigration work is it's often been a reactive struggle from a defensive position, responding to mass violence, really. Like these raids, I don't think we can downplay the fact that something like the shooting in El Paso, which is explicitly targeting, immigrants, is very parallel to the mass raid in Mississippi, and I'm stealing from a piece that came out in the Baffler today that compared the two.
From a comrade of ours.
Yes, so I think that in response to that defensive position, it's really time that we offered a positive vision, even if it's a lofty goal. We're not going to move forward unless we offer a positive vision, and I think that open borders does that. And I would like to see, and I think the others here would like to see this become sort of the Green New Deal or the Medicare for all for the immigrant justice movement.
Yeah, and I think the step that NYC, DSA, and DSA National took at their conventions of declaring this as our vision, as our horizon, was a great step in the right direction. But like, how do we reach this horizon? I don't think anyone has the complete answer here. That would be ridiculous. But like, what role does like something like demilitarization play in the opening of borders, at least?
I mean, I think demilitarization is a step along the way. I mean, I think if we can politicize people around specific policy goals, around showing that the border is very falsely constructed and has existed in its current form for a very brief time in history. And so if we harken back to that history, while we are also trying to decrease both the actual physical infrastructure and the police and military presence at the border, I think that is a clear way of sort of transforming the vision for what nations and borders are.
I also think that there's been a really a lopsided, sort of evolution of what's happened with the militarization of the border. It really began under Reagan, where there was this exchange that was made for, border security funding and then amnesty. But really what we've seen is that there's been no headway made on, Dreamers, or we haven't had any headway made for immigrant rights, and we've just had the border security really run amok. So I think that the demilitarization of it, is of course going to, help rebalance that. I mean, or tip the balance the other way.
And immigration was originally, like, long time ago, housed under the Labor Department, right? So I think that there's something we need to talk about, what it means that that the ICE was restructured under the Department of Homeland Security. Why is immigration considered a sort of a terrorist? Right. Why is it being conflated with like things like terrorism and violence, right?
Yeah, I think it shows the way that the imperial project has like been remaking itself after the war on terror and after kind of which is really just this crisis of American empire that is continually reproducing more and more violence across the globe. And I think by politicizing the border and making a declaration of open borders, we can make more people in this country realize that the enemy isn't on the outside, it's coming from inside the house, that the capitalist class is here, and if you want your life to be better, then you need to organize against them and build power. So you are listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. To connect with us after the show, you can email us at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for our newsletter to get links to what we talk about on our show. You can do that at our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com. And you can also find us on Twitter at NYCRPM. Today, we're talking about the struggle for immigrant justice and for open borders. And we have around 10 minutes left in the show. So this time, we want to open the phone lines and hear from our listeners. And you can call in at 212-209-2969. 2877. Again, please call us at 212-209-2877. So as our phone lines are opening, just like what are some like tactics and strategies that are in consideration in order to build both this like consciousness of around how like immigrants are part of the working class and building like immigrant worker power itself?
Yeah, there's a couple things, especially around sort of illuminating what open borders could be, is talking about specific policy prescriptions like demilitarization of the border or decriminalization of border crossing. That's a huge thing, but also just political education around this border violence that we've talked about on the radio here, but also just bringing this to our communities and the people in our lives. And because I think the idea of borders has become so ingrained in people's consciousness. So that's one thing, but also like we do have to turn back to local policy stuff and local struggles. So these legislative fights will continue. Direct actions can and will continue. We're looking to there's another big direct action being planned for September. With Close the Camps NYC, who organized this last one, and folks can check out closethecampsnyc.com. There's a national mobilization planned for October, and so I think you're going to see an escalation of these direct action techniques, but also things like community defense projects and community resiliency. So sanctuary, but also things like the hate-free zones that groups like the Desi's Rising Up and Moving have established to build community resiliency amongst immigrant communities.
And with the open resolution, the open borders resolution that we passed, we are going to see DSA, ramp up its sort of asking people who are running for office to really support this. This is something that we are really going to start pushing both locally here in New York City and just across the country.
Yeah, and I think it's often like misconstrued as something that would scare people off, but I think when it's presented in a way that really frames the discussion around how borders, especially as people see what's happening right now, I'd say most people in this country are horrified about what's happening down at the border, and that is something useful for us on our end. Obviously, it's horrible, and we wish it wasn't happening, but it's a way that we can highlight how this is inherent to how the system functions, and that the system itself is the problem. And if we don't have to shy away from having politicians center this in their discussions. They don't need to like play a game with the right, because the right, if you start playing a game with them, they will find a way to stab you in the back. So I just want to remind our listeners that the phone lines are open. That's 212-209-2877. Again, it's 212-209-2877. So, explain what the hate-free zones would be for people.
So this is not really my area of expertise. We have our Immigrant Justice Working Group has not gotten involved in these, but it really is about building community resilience and community-based solidarity, so that people can sort of undo these regimes of requiring ICE intervention or feeling like they need to call the police. And so building up that community solidarity as an alternative way of interacting and building community.
Yeah, one thing also that is not so much related, I guess, to that, but just in terms of strategy and political education, local organizing, I think one of the things that came out of the action on Saturday is that COSECHA is starting to organize or I guess educate the people in the building that are also, so ICE is housed in on the West Side Highway in this office building. They're there with, it's a big office building with other tenants, and they're sort of doing work to educate the people in that building that ICE is operating there, and sort of to put pressure on the building to, ICE should not be allowed to operate if they're, inflicting terror on our communities. So.
And I think that gets at sort of what a lot of these strategic interventions are doing. When we say, the border, we have to recognize that border is not just geographically located at the U.S.-Mexico border. It's everywhere, and that border violence is happening across our country. So things like the Laundry Workers Center is doing an action that's focused on Greyhound buses, and Border Patrol is often picking up people at Greyhound buses, and so and that gets at the fact that the Border Patrol operates in a jurisdiction that's a 100-mile radius from any port of entry to the U.S., and that doesn't just include the borders, that includes seaports and airports, and so the map of that is basically the entire country. So CBP and ICE have jurisdiction everywhere, which is why we have to, emphasize that the border is in so many places, and that's why an open borders framework all these other policies around demilitarizing the border and abolishing ICE fit under that framework.
Yeah, I think like that. The border has spread everywhere because what it really is a mechanism for like increasing the power of the state to put terror in the minds of working people and to undermine solidarity across the country. And I think everything that you've all been discussing really demonstrates like how this intersects with so many other issues, like in terms of like if someone can just like come, if a government agency can just like come into the apartment complex that you live without like any real authorization or at least any it reveals how there's like no democratic control over like our housing for so many people where we live, and how we need to be fighting for immigrants in those spaces and for all the tenants who live in those spaces, because the undemocratic ownership nature of housing empowers the state to inflict more violence on working people.
I mean, the public charge rule that just came out yesterday gets at that exactly. This idea that that immigrants are being limited from get access to any social services. The public charge rule is rooted historically in the same things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was to keep poor working class immigrants out of the social welfare system and exclude them from the public and then used as a weapon to deport them. And so that is why it's really important that we are doing this work in the Immigrant Justice Working Group. So this tends to be focused specifically on immigration policy, but that's what makes it exciting that we're organizing in this wider socialist movement for things like Medicare for all, housing for all, a Green New Deal, because these issues are all deeply intrinsically related, and we have to articulate the fact that we are fighting for rights for everybody, regardless of citizenship status, regardless of country that they live in or have lived in, and that this is an international struggle.
I think that's an incredible way to frame it, and a great way to wrap up the episode, unless anyone has any final thoughts they want to add. All right. Well, you have been listening to I Want Respect with Chris Cuomo. No, just... I have to throw a little dig at the corporate media when you're here on WBAI. But
broke my heart.
We're going to be covering the revolution in Cuba in 1959. Just kidding. No, you've been listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. You can connect with us after the show at revolutionsnyc@gmail.com or sign up for a newsletter to what we talk about. You can do that at revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com. And you can also find us at Twitter at NYCRPM. We're going to sign off, but we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
Can I just quickly plug that we've got the Immigrant Justice Working Group monthly meeting. The next one is Monday, September 9th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. And that's at socialists.nyc. And you can always reach out to us at immigrant.justice@socialist.nyc.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you to our listeners, as always.